audience, good morning to those of you who are in person, and those of you who are on live stream. We're just a tad bit delayed, but I'm looking forward to sharing with you some thoughts about a topic I've been thinking about all week. I have a calendar of topics, and ironically, or perhaps not, the last two times this topic has come up in my rotation have been Sundays when I've not been able to be here. So one of my colleagues has covered this topic, so I haven't done this topic in a little more than a year, and because my rotation is about 4 months. So the topic is mercy. And the reason I bring the topic of mercy to the chapel service, it's a late addition to my rotation of chapel topics, was that in the spring of 2018, I was at an event in Pittsburgh, of all places, and there was a woman who spoke at this event where I also was doing a presentation. Her name, I went back and looked, was Ellen Mady, M-A-D-Y. And Ellen is a person who works in the Roman Catholic administration in the Diocese of Pittsburgh. And she spoke so eloquently about the subject of mercy that it just stopped me in my tracks. And I thought, wow, that has to be a chapel topic. So I'd like to share with you a little bit about what Ellen said about mercy, about my own training as a Protestant practical theologian, which focuses more on grace than mercy in the Protestant sort of world, about a little bit about how mercy intersects with other religious traditions, and also how mercy might have bearing on you specifically sitting here or listening to the Caron Chapel message. I do think it's a great subject of depth and meaning and importance, and I will say a little prayer aloud that part of how it's touched my heart will come across given the chaos of this morning. So, what Ellen said about mercy that stopped me in my tracks was she suggested that mercy could be thought of as the point of intersection where suffering meets love. And I think it's, first of all, quite poetic and beautiful, and it makes me stop and think, suffering meeting love. And as I was saying just a moment ago, in my training, in my seminary education, there was a lot of focus on grace. And I was taught that grace was the unearned love of God. But if I was going to try and come up with a corresponding little triplet for grace versus mercy, I would say what I learned in my Protestant theological education is where failing meets love. Like our imperfection meets love is what grace's idea is, that we are forgiven. And in this mercy sense, where suffering meets love, they're close, because sometimes my suffering is self-inflicted. But what I really like about the idea of mercy is that it's generous and it does not imply the sense of blame. Whereas grace, in a certain sense, just implies the sense of blame. Like, I should be punished, but I'm not going to be. And it's not that mercy is always devoid of the idea of blame, but mercy can be present without blame in a way that I think is a nice nuance. And that has so much importance with respect to addiction, because one of the things that I see Caron as a key voice within the larger movement of addiction recovery, behavioral health care, is that the Bill W. of 1935 and 1939, a great guy who has helped many of us find long-term recovery. I'm in long-term recovery, and I owe my sobriety in many ways to Bill and Bob. But the development of the 12-step program and model for recovery is one that emerged in a context when people who suffered from the problem that brings us here were viewed as derelicts and losers and people of weak will, and there was this notion of shame and stigma that made it necessary for the movement to call itself Alcoholics Anonymous, because you would never go public about being an alcoholic because it would bring shame on you as if you were some sort of degenerate. And fortunately, we don't do that with like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or ADHD or a variety of other autism spectrum disorders. We don't, there may be Autism Spectrum Anonymous, and there probably possibly is a place for it, but if I meet you in a family setting and you are a parent and you tell me that your child has an autism spectrum disorder, I don't go, well, shame on you, and what did you do? Like, we never do that. But interestingly, I did have a fellow in a church that I served once who came to the church that I was serving because the church that he was serving kicked him out because his daughter had an addiction problem. And they told him that he was a bad parent. So, and this was 12, 15 years ago. So, this idea of shame and stigma is not gone from the disease of addiction. And the subject of mercy is one that I want to reflect a little bit more about because it's less shaming than the historic emphasis on sin. My predecessor in the role of chapel presider, Father Bill Holberg, who helped birth this service, used to have a very extraordinary gift of condensing things into very short statements that were deep and profound. And one of the ways he would talk about this distinction that is at the heart of this conversation today is that he thought of what brings people to Caron as sickness, not sin. And that's a really important, like, if you can allow yourself to have gentleness and self-compassion by thinking that what earned you the wristband is not all your fault and some sort of failure to exercise healthy choices. And you didn't just say no in the old Nancy Reagan way. And you're not appropriately to be labeled as somebody who failed to sort of get your act together, which is what our families often tell us. And instead could hear Father Bill and Ellen Meady and Reverend Jack and the turn that's happening in addiction treatment away from punitive and disciplinary and corrective measures to compassionate and empathetic and loving interventions that seek to meet people in a place of suffering and help them relearn things about how to respond to adversity. Because that's what's happened when you are an addict, is that you have developed a learned behavior which has become autonomic. So at some point somebody was like, here, take a drink, snort a line, do all this other stuff, and they were teaching you a behavior. And then you started having a response, and like a Pavlov response, it starts to become conditioned. And eventually, at some point, we're a small subset of people who lose the capacity to go, no, this is no longer working for me, I'm just going to stop. And it's not because we should shame ourselves that we didn't have that. There are a lot of people who do stop. I've known a ton of people who did tons of drugs in college, and now are like, not one of us, and I'm a little miffed by it, honestly. It bothers me. The woman I married 4 years ago, when I started dating her, she didn't know anything about people who were in recovery, and I had to give her the whole speech. I'm an alcoholic, I go to meetings, I have a sponsor, I'm probably never going to drink, but I'm not going to promise that, and this whole education I gave her, and she goes, well, how long has it been since you had a drink? And I said, 19 years, that was the time that helped me date the history of our relationship. Anyway, and she said, well, you're not an alcoholic then. And I said, no, yeah, I am. So 5 years later, we're introducing ourselves as a couple to somebody else, and they know what the kind of work that I do, and this person is a stranger, says, well, how long has it been since you had a drink? And I said, 24 years. And the guy said, well, you're not an alcoholic then, right? And my wife says, oh, yes, he is. So she's figured out over 5 years that I'm not. But in those 5 years, I was monitoring her drinking. I'm sure you're shocked at that. And I started counting, and when I was counting it, which I tried to cease doing, because now we're well into this relationship and married, and it's really kind of almost none of my business whether and when and how much, but what bothered me was she drank something like 6 to 8 drinks a month, which I just, why would you even bother, first of all, and like that's not even enough for one night in the Jack book. But I remember saying to her at one point, and then when I heard it come out of my mouth, I thought, God, that's hilariously funny. I said, if I could drink like you, I would drink every day. It's nice to have an audience that laughs at that, because I've said that before and had people think, like, God, you're weird. But that means that I'm in the right room, right? We are a peculiar lot who have come to be afflicted with a kind of suffering which we don't know how to get ourselves out of. And it's not because we're stupid, we're morally defective, or we're ineffectual. I would defy anyone who has that idea out in the world to come and spend a little while here with me and meet Caron patients who write beautiful songs, who build incredible enterprises, who earn consummate degrees in their fields, who publish extraordinary works, who raise incredible children, who just accomplish things that you would never imagine if this is a person who is weak-willed. And in fact, like to call an addict weak-willed is to not understand, because keep an addict from their drugs and watch their will activate. They're like pretty freaking creative. Like, I mean, the number of times, I remember, and I'm not trying to give anybody ideas, but we had somebody figure out how to get to Amazon and have Kratom delivered to the door down the street, right? And then, like, snuck off and picked up their Kratom, and the next thing you know, they're, like, bringing an opioid on campus and putting everybody's life at risk. But that's the creativity and ingenuity and resolve and willfulness of an addict. So saying that those of us who suffer from this suffer from it because we're weak-willed is an absurd allegation. We do this because we can't stop ourselves. Not because we would if we could. And people who are pointing that finger of shame and blame is, why don't you just stop? Have zero insight into the captivity and the misery and the shame that does come, which is when we watch ourselves do things that we know we shouldn't. We step outside of our own values, and we don't show up when our children are celebrating milestones, and we puke at Christmas, and we do these things that bring such pain on other people, and some part of us inside knows. I believe that. I honestly believe that the most seemingly sociopathic and narcissistic among us, there is somewhere inside of most of us a kernel of human decency and of kindness and of empathy that is just quashed by the opioid or the stimulant or the sedative or the hypnotic, whatever it is that is your cocktail of choice, and often it's a mix of those things. And Musics too, like that's another thing people take, and the drugs that you use are a clue to the pain you are trying to medicate. So we are people who are habituated to respond to our suffering in a way that no longer is useful for us. And we are entitled to be viewed with dignity and empathy and compassion, rather than being viewed in the way that our society has placed us for a very long time. And as soon as the society will begin to move away from the finger-pointing, blame-alleging, ego-deflating narrative, the sooner it will become clear that many of us can and do recover. That's another lie that's out there. People think people can't get well and don't get well. People get well from this affliction in extraordinary numbers. So don't people are like, oh, rehab doesn't work, whatever. That's actually not true. People do better with this illness than many other illnesses. And it is a chronic condition, so if you're thinking it's a quick fix and 28 days repairs it, you're being naive. But that would be the same thing if you thought you could take blood pressure medication for 28 days and then stop taking it, and the issue would be addressed. If you did that with dietary changes and a variety of other lifestyle changes, then perhaps you could cease the medication. And that's actually just as true with addiction. So there's now medication-assisted treatment to help people stay alive as they do work to begin to retrain the brain. It's a brain retraining problem. And how do you retrain human brains? One of the most extraordinarily powerful tools and the re-education of the human brain is not barking, and it's not intellectual, academic, systemic stuff. It's actually love. Love is one of the things that causes people to change. And you can look at therapeutic modalities, EMDR, CBT, ACT, DBT, all these three-letter acronyms that describe these manualized methods of behavioral change that help people a lot. But if you look under the hood and look at the interaction between the clinician and the person, there's something besides the method that's going on, because one person administering the method will be more successful than the next. And what that has to do with, or one person will have the method applied by one practitioner and not work, and then go to another practitioner and it work better because of rapport. And this has been long identified in behavioral health. The understanding that the sort of precursor of effectiveness in behavioral health care is rapport. It is a kind of willingness that you must have to trust me to help you change your life. And if you give me that, I have immense power to really, sadly, inflict tremendous harm, but I also have incredible power to implant seeds in you of hope and motivation that will elicit in you a response that will take you on a journey that is one of your own offering and creation. And then I can't take credit for your recovery, but it does depend on love. Just like when a couple go through a difficult trial and they end up a stronger couple on the next side of it, it's not because one fixed the other, it's because they talk it through, and in their intimacy and understanding of the complex dynamics that brought the adversity to bear, each of them learns, and they begin to sort of function now in a new systemic way, in a new rhythm. So one of the things I really want people to understand why mercy is necessary is that this is a set of concerns that ought not to be oversimplified. We call it addiction. We have one diagnosis. We have 11 criteria. We have 28 days. We have a whole and that's because we live in a world that wants to codify and classify and objectify and reify and make binary things that are not binary. So, do you have an addiction or don't you? The likelihood is if you're sitting in the chair, you probably do. But are there co-occurring or even antecedent influences that help bring about your addictive disorder? And the answer is yes. And trauma, grief, family dysfunction, personal, spiritual, moral injury, distrust, even paradoxically, coddling can sort of weirdly be what turns out to be a kind of bizarre precursor, because then this whole dimension of entitlement manifests in people who have been sort of over-nurtured, and when then the system lets them go, they're at a loss, and they seek something that will coddle them instead of the parent that's suddenly gone or the system that's suddenly gone. So the readings that we're going to hear today include a passage from Shakespeare, which I find so incredibly beautiful. It's the only time I ever use Shakespeare's readings at chapel, but it's a passage from The Merchant of Venice in which this ancient poet reflects on mercy, and he talks about mercy as something more powerful than the power that a king exerts through their military authority. And there's a line in the, it's like a soliloquy, I guess, there's a line in there where he talks about when mercy seasons justice. And I'm not saying that we aren't due certain consequences for the things that we've done. Some of you may be facing DUI charges or legal concerns of another sort, or marital challenges, or custody battles and all those things. And perhaps in some sense, I don't mean to be mean, but perhaps in some sense rightly so, for the sake of the protection of children and society. Like, I was arrested several times for DUI, and I went through processes that I think are in some ways, I understand why they exist. But if mercy is not present to season justice, then none of us walk. None of us, if it's all about punishment for things we fail to accomplish, I'm sorry, there's just no one who gets away scot-free. I mean, some of us fall prey to these circumstances and do more harmful acts than others, and some of us also suffer injuries, not of our own doing more than others. That's one of the things, I think as a child, I wanted to believe that life was fair, but as a chaplain, I have come to believe that life is not fair, and that some people suffer more than others, and I saw one of those little like wood plaques that said, "Hey, Karma, I want to show you some people you forgot." And that's one of the problems with this notion of equity, is that it doesn't bear itself out in the world in which we live. But the invitation that I want to offer you today is one that is rooted in this idea that love will be more helpful than judgment or punishment. And that we had a rival facility at one time. There's competitive dynamics in everything in life, and there was a competitive treatment facility. We used to criticize Caron for being overly loving. Well, I'm totally good with that. If that's what you're going to accuse me of, like, I'm not sure I feel bad at all about loving persons who are being so stigmatized and so shamed. Because I think there is a potency in this love that will help you. And so to remember what Ellen Beatty said and what Shakespeare says about mercy, and I missed pieces of my outline. There's a whole Buddhist thing about mercy, by the way. Mercy is not the province of Christianity or Catholicism alone. Mercy is so there it is in Shakespeare. But also, if you're into the Buddhist thing, karuna is a word for compassion in the practice of Buddhist life, and there's prayers. We're going to hear a Buddhist prayer for karuna. And interestingly, there's a teacher, a Dharma teaching that I read once after I had heard Ellen Beatty, and I thought it was so interesting because it explains karuna as where Ellen Beatty said mercy is where suffering meets love, and this teacher said karuna is where love meets suffering. And so this intersection, and it is a quality of the divine to be merciful, but it also is accessible to all. We can all be merciful, and we all suffer. So we can receive mercy and we can give mercy. This is something that is in your reach. I'm not talking about something that it means you have to walk a foot off the ground or become holy in some way that you know you will fall short of within hours of trying to make your New Year's Eve pledge. I'm just saying that mercy is in our grasp. And I would plead with you, I'm going to turn that off in a minute, to be merciful with yourself and with one another. Because if we could bring that tone to our peer community, and if the clinical teams too can share and bring this as a guiding principle, a steering vision, that what this is about receiving people who are broken and helping them to learn to function adequately and